ለመማር ወደ ትምህርት ተቋም መሄድ ግድ አይደለም። ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
ራሳችሁን ከኮሮና ቫይረስ ወረርሽኝ እየጠበቃችሁ በቤታችሁ ወይም በተመቻችሁ ቦታ በኢንተርኔት አማካኝነት በኦንላይን ትምህርታችሁን መከታተል ትችላላችሁ።
ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና ከእንግሊዙ ኢንስቲትዩት ኦፍ ኮመርሻል ማኔጅመንት ICM ጋር በመተባበር የሚሰጡ ትምህርቶችን ተከታትላችሁ በ6 ወር ጊዜ በዓለም አቀፍ ደረጃ ተቀባይነት ያለውን የስልጠና ማስረጃ ባለቤት መሆን ይቻላል።
ልምድ ባላቸው መምህራን እየተማራችሁ ጥያቄና መልስ የክፍል ስራዎች ፈተና መፈተን ክፍል ውስጥ እንዳላችሁት አይነት በኦንላይን ባላችሁበት ቦታ ከናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ
Good afternoon, students. Is my voice audible? Brooke, my voice is my voice audible? Okay. Thank you. Now we can start the teaching learning process. As you remember, in our last session, we have seen fallacy of weak induction and fallacy of relevance. Today we will probably we may finish this chapter if possible, so we can start our today teaching learning process. In the last session we have seen that fallacy of relevance is committed because of the irrelevance of the premise to the conclusion. In the case of fallacy of relevance. And also we have said in the case of fallacy of weak induction, we have said the fallacy is committed because of the premise is insufficient to strongly support the conclusion. So that the fallacy is committed. In the case of fallacy of presumption, it is not because of the premises are insufficient to support the conclusion and is not because of irrelevant of the premise to the conclusion. Rather, it is because of that the premise presumes what the argument purport to prove. It's because of that this fallacy of presumption is committed. So the problem or the reasoning process here what is omitted in the case of fallacy of presumption is because of the premise presume what the purport to prove, but in reality, or its truth is not this one. So it presumes as the premise is purport to the conclusion. Under this fallacy of presumption, we will see around 4 subcategories of fallacy of presumption. That is, the first one is begging the question. The second one is the complex question, and the third one is false dichotomy, and the last one is the suppressed evidence. So let's look at each subcategories of fallacy of presumption one by one. As I have told you, all forms of fallacies, all types of fallacies try to use a kind of emotional appealing, emotional ground to convince the reader or the listener. And we have heard that in argument, there must be truth value, which means an argument must be a kind of declarative statement that can be, that has or a kind of truth value which can be true or false. In line with this, we have said commands, questions are not arguments in general. So don't be confused here, the begging the question. It's a question, but it can be served as an argument. But the problem here is that the premises presume to purport to the conclusion, but in reality, it does not at all. So even though questions are not arguments here, it's an argument, but is not in a way that shows a kind of legitimate reasoning process between the premises and the conclusion. So that in the case of begging the question, the premise presumes a kind of, or presumes the premise provide adequate support for the conclusion, when in fact they do not purport to the conclusion in the case of begging the question. In the case of complex questions, the premises presume that a question can be answered by a simple yes, no, yes or no, or other brief answers, very short brief answer, when that questions may deserve or it may need a kind of elaborated or sophisticated answer. But this is not the case. In the case of complex question, we'll see how the fallacy is committed in the case of these two. And the third one is a false dichotomy. As you can understand easily from the name, the dichotomy refers to two, either or. So in the case of fallacy of dichotomy, it tried to presume that an either or statement presents jointly as if they are exhaustive alternatives. When we screen out, when we look in detail, the fact is not that one. There might be many alternatives, but in this false dichotomy, it only provides two alternatives, either or. By ignoring other alternatives, by using the disjunctive either or. Interpressed evidence presumes that no important evidence has been overlooked by the premise when in fact it has. It has a little bit relation with oversimplified, because we'll look how it is happened. Begging the questions. It also known as Pitto principle, the Latin equivalent, which refers to request seeking for the source or requesting the source. The equivalent meaning of Pitto principle is requesting for source. The Latin name, and it's also equivalent with begging the question. And this begging as a question is committed when the arguer when the speaker creates the illusion that inadequate premises provide adequate support. You see, inadequate premises provide adequate support for the conclusion by leaving out the possible false or shaky key premises, by restating the possible false premises as the conclusion, or by reasoning in a circle. The actual source of the support of the conclusion in the case of begging the question is not apparent. So the argument decides to be beg the listener, begging the question. As the name shows, is begging the question. After reading or hearing the argument, the observer is inclined to ask, how do you know X? Where X is needed a support? Of course, it needs a support, but we cannot apparently found on the premises of the argument. But the observer may incline to raise questions like this one. So there are around 3 known forms of begging the questions. The first and the most common ways of committing the fallacy of begging the question is leaving possible false key premises without providing a kind of possible false key premise out of the argument. Here, what the speaker or the arguer did it that he simply leaving those possible false premises which are explicitly observable. So by leaving those premises, the argument while creating an illusion that nothing more is needed to establish the conclusion. Look at this example. Murder is morally wrong. It says, it's a premise. This being the case, it follows that abortion is morally wrong. What an arguer here ignores or leave out as a support is that he only tells the listener or the reader as murder is morally wrong, then he concludes that abortion is morally wrong. You see, you can understand there is other premises which is purposefully leave out from this argument. If the arguer give us that support or that evidence between these premises and this conclusion, it may become legitimate, but he's not give us that important evidence. It says the argument begs the question, how do you know that abortion is a form of murder? It says murder is a morally wrong. It assumes this as it is true, but without saying that abortion is a form of murder, a form of, how we can say that at the conclusion, abortion is morally wrong. If there was a premise which says abortion is a form of murder, we can conclude that without begging, abortion is morally wrong, if abortion is a form of murder. But here, he leaves or he left that premises. Simply, what he begs the listener, or he begs the question to accept this argument. But the listener may raise question like, How do you know that the abortion is a form of murder? This is how the begging the question in the case of the first way how the fallacy is committed. Look at the second example. Of course, humans and apes evolved from common ancestors. This is the first premises. From these premises, we conclude, just look how similar they are. The second, begging the question, does the mere fact human and apes look similar implies that they evolved from common ancestors? Does it mean that? It raises such kinds of questions. They evolved from common. So here also what the arguer is did is that he begged the questions to the listener. By here also he leave out the important evidence within the argument. He must add that how the ape and humans comes from common ancestors. So this question indicates that something has been left out of the original argument. What you can understand from the above two examples, important evidences, premises are left out from this. So what the arguer tried to do is presuming the premise to support the conclusion as if it is true. But it leaves out very important support or evidence. As I have told you in the first argument, the missing premises is abortion is a form of murder. He does not tell the listener whether abortion is a form of murder or not at all. He did say nothing. In the case of the second example, the arguer leaves or meets the premise. If humans look similar, then they have common ancestors, and so on. So these premises are crucial for the soundness of the argument. These two, that abortion is a form of murder, and this was the second one is that the most crucial premises which makes our argument sound, but the arguer does not say anything about this supports. That is what it makes fallacious. The second form of begging the question is occurs when the conclusion of an argument merely restates, possibly. Here is an important, very key expression, restates. A possible false premise in slightly different language. You see? The only difference between the premise and the conclusion here is that paraphrasing or the way it expresses it, the conclusion repeats the premise only through restating what the premise says, using slightly a little bit different language, but indeed similar message. In such an argument, the premise supports it, the conclusion, and the conclusion tended to reinforce the premises. Look at this example. It says capital punishment is justified for crimes of murder and kidnapping because it's quite legitimate and appropriate that someone be put the death for having committed such hateful and inhuman acts. You see, here in the premises justified. It says it's justified. And it tried to add here quite legitimate and appropriate. So here the nearly only there is a kind of slight language expression difference, but they have nearly the same meaning. Only the conclusion, what the conclusion did is that elaborating or restating what has been clearly shown in the premise, that is justified. The meaning above this one and after this one are nearly similar. Nearly similar. So as you see, saying that capital punishment justified in the first premises means the same thing as saying that legitimate and appropriate. Legitimate, similar, is the same thing. Nothing has been added. So by repeating the same thing in a slightly different language, the arguer creates a kind of illusion that independent evidence is being presented in support of the conclusion. But though it presumes to prove that one, in fact, it is not at all. Nearly they have the same side. Saying justified and appropriate here. Look, justified and here legitimate and appropriate. The same message. And the third forms of begging the question or petio principi involves circular reasoning. The second case is the way the language is expressed by restating the premises into the conclusion. Here, in the case of the third, is the circular reasoning in a chain of inference, having the first premise that is possibly false. Look at this example. Harar Brewery clearly produced the finest beer in Ethiopia. The finest, we know they produce the finest beer because they have the best chemists. This is because they can afford to pay them more than other brewery. Obviously, they can afford to pay them more than other brewery. Obviously, they can afford to pay them more because they produce the finest beer in the country. So here, there is a kind of circular reasoning. There is nothing new. So upon encountering this argument, the attentive reader, one who is skeptical and looks critically the argument, inclined to ask, he may raise question, where does this reasoning begin? What is its source? Since the argument go in a circle, it has no beginning or source, and as the result, it proves something. It is difficult to know where which one is the premise and which one is the conclusion, or where the reasoning process starts. Let's look at the second types of the fallacy of presumption, that is complex question. The fallacy of complex question is committed when two or more questions are asked in the guess of the single questions, and a single answer is then given to both of them. Here's the questions. The question contains many questions implicitly, but only giving a single answer for those multiple or more questions. Look this example for better understanding of how complex fallacy of complex question is committed. Have you stopped cheating on exam? This is the first. The second one is, where did you hide the corpse of the person you killed? Assume that, or let us assume that the answer for the first question, that is, have you stopped cheating on exam? Assume that, yes, I have stopped cheating on exam. And let's assume for the second questions, where did you hide the corpse of the person you killed? Assume the person says, under the bed. Very clear and specific answer for this complex question. You were asked, then we argue in this way. You were asked whether you have stopped cheating on exam. You answer yes. Therefore, it followed that you have cheating in the past. And for the second example, you were asked, you were hiding the body of the person you killed, and you replied under the bed. It followed that you are in fact killing that person. You see how the fallacy is committed? So in both cases, we may raise two questions in both examples. The first question is, did you cheat on exam in the past? If you did cheating in the past, have you stopped it now? You see how many multiples question can be raised from that simple argument. For the second example, where did you hide the corpse of the person you killed? If you killed it, where did you hide it? Really, it contains this amount of question, but we simply try to give a kind of specific and brief, short response for that multiple questions, while we're expected to elaborate those cases. But this is not the case in point in this fallacy. That is why we say fallacy is committed.
በትምህርት ከፍ ብሎ መብረር ይቻላል። ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ከከፍተኛ ትምህርት አግባብነትና ጥራት ኤጀንሲ ሙሉ ዕውቅናን ባገኘንባቸው በማስተርስ ዲግሪ ኤምቢኤ በስትራቴጂክ ማኔጅመንት፣ ኤምቢኤ በባንኪንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ ኤምቢኤ በቢዝነስ ሊደርሺፕ፣ ኤምቢኤ በሪስክና ኢንሹራንስ፣ ኤምኤስሲ በኢንተርናሽናል ትሬድ እና ኢኮኖሚክስ ዘርፎች በእውቀት ለመቅረጽ የበቁ ፕሮፌሰሮቻችን አረንጓዴ መብራታቸውን አብርተዋል። በነገራችን ላይ በኬንያ ሀገር ከሚገኙ ስመጥር ዩኒቨርሲቲዎች በሚመጡ ፕሮፌሰሮች የትኩረት መስክ ትምህርቶቹ መሰጠታቸው ልዩ ያደርገናል። በምርጥ የትምህርት ስርዓት የተገነባው ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ በመጀመሪያ ዲግሪ በአቪዬሽን ማኔጅመንት፣ በሆቴል ማኔጅመንት፣ በአካውንቲንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ በማርኬቲንግ ማኔጅመንት አስተማማኝ ትምህርት ይገቢውና ራስዎንና ሀገሮን ይለውጡ። አድራሻ 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።
So they think let us move to the third types of fallacy of that is false dichotomy. The fallacy of false dichotomy is committed when a disjunctive either or premises present two unlikely alternatives as if they were the only ones available, and the arguer then eliminates undesirable alternatives, leaving the desirable one at the conclusion. The arguer then, you see, eliminates the undesirable alternatives, leaves the desirable one as a conclusion. In such argument is clearly valid, but since the disjunctive premise is false, or at least probably false, the argument is typically unsound. The fallacy is often committed by children when arguing with their parents by advertisers and adults. False dichotomy. If you, for example, let's look at this example. Either you are going to buy me a new car, or I will divorce you. Either you are going to buy me a new car, or I will divorce you. You don't want me divorce you. Thus, you have to buy me a new car. The fallacy nature of the false dichotomy lies in the illusion created by the arguer that the disjunctive premise is present during the exhaustive alternative. But in reality, there might be many other alternatives for this argument other than divorce. But he presents as if it is the only alternatives. That is why with a fallacy has been committed. If one of the alternative in disjunctive premises is true, then the fallacy is not committed. You see? Because the argument will become valid and sound. Look at this example. Even though there is either or disjunctive clause, this argument is both valid and sound. Look, either Abba River is in Ethiopia or it is in South Africa. River Abba is not in South Africa. Therefore, River Abba is in Ethiopia. Disjunctive syllogism is sound. It's a deductive sound argument. It does not commit any fallacy. The other names of false dichotomy is also known as false bifurcation or either or fallacy. It can be also known as. The fourth one is suppressed evidence. The requirement of true premises included the proviso that premises not ignore some important piece of evidence that outweighs the presented evidence and entails a very different conclusion. If an inductive argument does indeed ignores such evidences, then the argument commits the fallacy of suppressed evidence. Suppressed. Oversimplifying evidence. As I have told you, it has a little bit relation with oversimplified cause. We suppressed the important evidence. Look at this example. Somali is a good place for investment for the following reason. The first reason is cheap raw materials. The second is cheap labor. The third is good market for the product. And the fourth, there is the airport that help us to export our product. This we have to consider investing in Somalia. You see, here there is a kind of suppressed evidence fallacy. Because even though we have these all opportunities, if there is no peace and security or peace and stability, which is the major reason that makes investment good in Somalia, but it ignores, it suppressed the role of peace and security here. So if the arguer ignores the fact there is no peace and stability, for example, if there is no peace and stability in Somalia, how it could be possible to say that investment is good there in Somalia without having peace? So in order to make our argument better off and legitimate and adequate, we should not be suppressed this evidence that is peace and stability in Somalia. Okay, it's all about fallacy. The first categories of fallacy, that's fallacy of presumption. Now, let us move to fallacy of ambiguity and grammatical analogy. In one way or another way, we have seen how fallacy of ambiguity and grammatical analogy is occurred, because we have seen a lot of preliminary concepts on language and how defect is committed in logic because of poor expression of grammar. So I think you have a preliminary understanding of this concept. So when the conclusion of an argument depends on the shifting the meaning of the ambiguous word or phrase, or the wrong interpretation of an ambiguous word or phrase or a statement, the argument commits fallacy of ambiguity. So fallacy of ambiguity is committed because of the ambiguous nature of the argument, the contents within the argument, then the statement, the word, the interpretation of the phrase, and such like. So this fallacy of ambiguity includes the equivocation and amphiboly. This fallacy arises because of the occurrence of some forms of ambiguity, either in the premise or in the conclusion, or in both the premise and the conclusion. So simply, fallacy of ambiguity is committed because of the ambiguous nature of the premise or the conclusion. Or it might be because of the ambiguous nature of the word, the phrase, or the statement within the argument. So the fallacy of grammatical analogy includes composition and division. We'll look at what they mean. Argument is that commits fallacy of grammatical analogy are grammatically analogous to the other arguments, and that are good in every respect, even though they are good in the other aspects of argument. If they lack or if they commit a kind of grammatical analogy, because they commit a fallacy. No matter how they are adequate in other respects. Because of this similarity, that is the linguistic structure, such fallacious arguments may be appear good yet be bad. It is the very nature of fallacies. Let's look at fallacy of ambiguity, the first. A fallacy, this fallacy arises from the occurrence of some form of ambiguity, either in the premise or in the conclusion, as we have said. An expression, we have said that an expression is said to be ambiguous if there is susceptible to different interpretation in context. Within a single context, if there is different distinct interpretation of the term, a phrase, or a statement, we say that the expression is unambiguous. Whether the conclusion of an argument depends on a shift in meaning of the ambiguous word or a phrase, or the wrong interpretation of the ambiguous statement, then the argument commits the fallacy of ambiguity. So the fallacy is committed when it is interpreted out of the intention of what the arguer wants to transfer. You see? Because of that problem or error that the fallacy of ambiguity is committed. Let's look at the first subcategories of fallacy of ambiguity, that is equivocation. The fallacy of equivocation occurs when the conclusion of an argument depends on the fact that a word or a phrase is used either explicitly or implicitly in two different senses in the argument. Such arguments are either invalid or have a false premise. In either case, they are unsound. Look this example. The first example that says any law can be repealed by legislative authority. It says any law, any law. The second premise says, but the law of creativity is a law. Therefore, the law of creativity can be repealed by the legislative authority. The second example says we have a duty to do what is right. Duty, what is right. Here we have the right to speak. It's right. In defense of innocence. Therefore, we have the duty to speak out in the defense of innocence. In the first example, here, the word law, that is all law, and the law of gravity, in the first premise, it means the statutory law. All law refers to the state law, statutory laws, not natural laws such as gravity. And the second law means law of nature. You see the difference? Whereas in the case of the second example, right in two senses. In the first, Right means morally correct. But in the second, it means just claim or power. The second subcategories of fallacy of ambiguity is Amphiboly. And this fallacy occurs when the arguer misinterprets an ambiguous statement and then draws conclusion based on this false interpretation. So that the ambiguity usually arises from a mistake in a grammar or a punctuation. That is, it can be missing a comma, it can be dangling modifiers such as her, she, his, like that one, an ambiguous antecedent of pronoun, or some other careless arrangement of words can be committed because of these failures. Because of this ambiguity, the statement may be understood into clear distinguished way. They are going to typically select the unintended, the unwanted interpretation, and proceeds to draw a conclusion dependent on that unintended interpretation. Look at this example. He says the tour guide said that standing in Mescal Square, the new federal police building could easily be seen. It followed that the Empire State built in Greenwich Village. And the second example says, Houghton told MacArthur that he had made a mistake. It follows that Houghton has at least the courage to admit his own mistake. So there is a kind of difference between the Amphiboly and equivocation. In the case of equivocation, is always stressed to an ambiguity in the meaning of the word or the phrase, whereas in the case of Amphiboly, it involves synastical ambiguity in the statement. It can be problem of dangling modifier. The second difference is that in the case of Amphiboly, usually it involves mistakes made by the arguer in the interpreting an ambiguous statement made by someone else, whereas the ambiguity is equivocation is typically the arguer's own creation. It is a creation of the arguer himself. This is where the difference lies between these fallacies of ambiguity. Let's look at the final types of fallacies. That's fallacy of grammatical analogy. Fallacy of grammatical analogy are grammatically analogous to the other arguments that are good in every respect. Because of this similarity in linguistic structure, such fallacious argument may appear good yet be bad. Let's look at the first types of fallacy of fallacy of grammatical analogy. Sorry, students. Fallacy of composition is committed when the conclusion of an argument depends on the erroneous of transferring of an attribute from the part of something onto the whole. You see? From the part of something on the whole. In other words, the fallacy occurs when it is argued that because the part have certain attributes, it follows that the whole has that attribute too, and situation inside that the attribute in question cannot be legitimately transferred from parts to the whole. Look, this example. Is each player on the basketball team is an excellent. It's all about the part. Here it concludes the team in general. The whole is excellent. The second example is each atom in this piece of chalk is invisible, of course. Therefore, the chalk is invisible. You see how the fallacy is committed? Using reasoning process from parts or specific things to the conclusion. But when we look at it, it does not work at all. In this argument, the attributes that are transferred from part on the whole are designed by the word excellent, invisible, and deadly poison, respectively. In the case, the transfer is illegitimate, and so the argument is fallacious. Not every such transfer is illegitimate. Okay, I think it's better to give you a tea break because I too need a break. So please come back after 5 minutes. Okay, now we can proceed, students. Okay, the second fallacy of grammatical analogy is division is opposite or the reverse of composition. As composition goes from part to the whole, division goes from the whole to the part is the reverse. And the fallacy is committed when the conclusion of an argument depends on the erroneous transfer of an attribute from the whole or class onto the part or the member. Look here's example. Salt is a non-poisonous compound. It is general. There is components, the specific components that is sodium, chlorine, and are non-poisonous. Therefore, the reasoning process flow from general to specific elements or from the whole to the parts. The Royal Society is over 300 years old. The Royal Society. Gerald married Hussein is members of the Royal Society, is a member of the Royal Society. Therefore, Gerald married Hussein is over 300 years old. You see how it flows from the whole to its parts, direct opposite of. In each of these cases, the attribute as designated respectively by the term non-poisonous and over 300 years old is illegitimately transferred from the whole or the class into the parts or the members. As with the fallacy of composition, however, this kind of transfer is not always legitimate. There are also legitimate transfer without committing a fallacy. Look, this piece of chalk has mass. Therefore, atoms that compose this piece of chalk have mass. This fallacy, this argument does not contain any fallacy. There is transferability here. Conclusion. In this chapter, in chapter 5, we have seen all about fallacy, about false reasoning. And we have said fallacy is a mistake in an argument that arises something other than mere false premises. And we have said that fallacies can be in general formal or informal. So fallacy is all about defect or a flawed reasoning. It's a false reasoning process. Fallacy is committed because of many reasons. It might be because of the irrelevance of the premise to the conclusion. It might be because of insufficiency of the evidence to the conclusion. It might be because of the presumption of the premise to the conclusion. It might be because of the defect or the use of language within an argument. It might be because of the grammatical problems. But what makes all them similar is that they try to use a kind of emotional ground, psychological attachments, using a kind of what value-laden words, value that increase feelings on the minds of the listener or the reader. This is what fallacy in general is. When we see their typology, they can be both formal and informal. In the case of formal fallacy, we have said that we can easily identify or distinguish by mere observation of the structure of the argument. Whereas in the case of informal, we cannot able to distinguish where the fallacy is committed by simply looking at the structures of the argument. We can identify where the problem is committed or where the error is committed by looking at in detail the content of the argument. The content might be the language problem, it might be the reasoning process, and etc. And in our last session, we have exhaustively looked at those typologies of informal fallacies. We have said that fallacy of relevance is committed because of the irrelevance of the premises to the conclusion. In all cases of fallacy of relevance, such as argument based on using force, using appeal to pity, using all others or the remaining other parts of the fallacy of relevance are in general committed because of the irrelevance of the premise to the conclusion, except missing the point. We have said in the case of missing the point, what is irrelevant is not the premise, rather the conclusion. The conclusion is irrelevant to the premises. And we have said the fallacy of weakened action is committed when the premises are inadequate or insufficient to support the conclusion, though they purport to prove it as if it is sufficient and adequate to support the conclusion. But really, it is not the case. And today we have seen fallacy of presumption is occurred because of that the presumes was the premise tried to presume to support or purport to prove the conclusion, but in reality it is not the case. So the fallacy of ambiguity occurs when the conclusion depends on some linguistic ambiguity. And the fallacy of grammatical analogy occurs when the defect of argument appears good owing to a grammatical similar to some argument that is not fallacious. I think it's better to stop here. Please, if you have any question, you're welcome, unless it's better to stop here.
ልዩነት መፍጠር ዓላማችን ነው። ዓለም አቀፍ ተወዳዳሪ መሆን አለባችሁ። የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ጥራትና ደረጃውን የጠበቀ ስልጠና በመስጠት ብቁ ዜጋ እያፈራን ነው። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ፣ በቲኬቲንግና ሪዘርቬሽን፣ በሆቴልና ቱሪዝም ሙያዎች አሰልጥነን ተወዳዳሪ እናደርጎታለን። ኮሌጃችን ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና ከእንግሊዙ ICM ጋር በመተባበር ዓለም አቀፍ ዕውቅና ያለው ስልጠና እየሰጠ ይገኛል። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ የምንሰጣቸው ስልጠና ከኢትዮጵያ ሲቪል አቪዬሽን ባለስልጣን ሙሉ ዕውቅና አለው። አድራሻ ከጎላጉል ታወር 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።